Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here and for taking an interest in my book. So what I'm going to do is really give you an overview of the argument of the book, but not go into it in too much detail. What I will start by doing is give you some background to the book, so you know what the context is in which I wrote it. Then I'll outline the main arguments, and then I'll say something about why I think it's significant. And then perhaps I'll just finish by saying a little bit about my most recent work to see where it is that my thinking has led since the Liberal Archipelago. So I wrote this book initially because I was engaged in a debate within liberal political theory and among theorists of multiculturalism in particular. There was an argument that had developed to the effect that liberal societies and liberal theories had been deficient because they hadn't really taken into account the importance not just of individual rights, but the importance of the rights and claims of people in groups. The fact that group membership was important was held to be something that liberal political theorists and liberal institutions more generally had failed to recognize. And so this was an address that I tried, a position I tried to address in my earliest writings about multiculturalism, in which I tried to defend a more individualist perspective on cultural rights. I want to suggest that, in fact, we didn't need to have special rights for cultures, that the most important thing was really to recognize the claims of individuals. But as I pursued this argument, I found myself getting more and more involved in trying to understand basic political institutions and the larger arguments that were being made for a liberal political ideal. And so I found myself engaging not only with the very important and influential work of theorists like Will Kymlicka, who were writing in Canada in defense of a theory of multiculturalism, but I also found myself engaging with thinkers like John Rawls, Robert Nozick, and others, because they were trying to advance a theory of a good society more generally. And what they were trying to do was offer an account of what a good society was like by saying that this is what a just society would be like. And it is at this point, I think, that I started to think that the idea of thinking about society in this way, to try to think about society and its institutions and the political principles that underpin it from the perspective of an understanding of it as a closed system, was where things started to go wrong. Because while I still wanted to defend the idea of individual rights, and defend the idea of thinking about political institutions from the perspective of the individual, I started to see that the reason for many multiculturalists having a problem with liberal political theory had to do really with the starting point of trying to think about a political order or a political society from the perspective of a single closed political society. And it's out of this that I started to think about whether or not political society was, in fact, a single united structure or institution within which all social life should be understood. I started to question the idea of whether the state was the appropriate starting point for reflection on questions of political theory. And this is what led to the title of the book, because as I worked on this, the more I started to think about political society, not as something that was fixed or closed within which we should theorize. I started to think about it as really something that was more like a collection of interacting communities which did not have a single determinate shape or set of borders. Because in fact, in the end, people related to one another, not so much as individuals who were united by their allegiance to or membership of a state, they related to each other in more complex ways because they were at the same time members of different communities, associations, and so on. So I wanted to develop a theory of this that suggested that human beings were associated with one another, not simply according to this one single idea of a unified community. So there were two other prominent metaphors that have been used in the history of political philosophy to try to describe a political society. Probably the most famous of these, at least in Western thought, is the idea of society as a ship of state. We find this idea in Plato's Republic, where Plato talks about how to think about a political society and how to justify the need for political authority. And his argument is simply, look, we're all like the crew and passengers on a ship. And the ship is not going to stay afloat or reach its destination unless it has a captain, someone with authority and knowledge, capable of guiding the ship to its destination. And so this is how we should see ourselves as a political community, he suggested. We are all members of this single entity. And many centuries later, in the 20th century, we see a very similar metaphor being used by the conservative philosopher Michael Oakeshott. In defense of conservatism, he says we should see ourselves as members of a ship, although in his case, he said, the ship has no particular destination. All we're trying to do is keep it afloat. And this is why we need political authority. But it struck me immediately that, of course, we aren't like members of a ship in isolation on an ocean, because we're on a vessel, if we are on one at all, in which people come and go. People live and die, but also people change ships. They move to different parts of the ocean. We live in a world that's, in a sense, ironically, much more fluid than the metaphor of the ship of state allows. So this was one metaphor I wished to reject. The other one I also thought about quite a lot was the metaphor used by the 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who asks us to think about the state as paralleled by or modeled after the human body. The state is, in a sense, like a single body that's made up of arms, legs, and torso, and of course a head. The composite is the state, but the state only operates effectively if the head is in command. But this entity that he imagines that models political society is one which is once again given its power by the conception of a unified entity, something that is bounded, something that's, in a sense, unchangeable. But once again, it was a metaphor, I thought, that was, if not unattractive, at least incomplete, because once again, the body in question is not something that's unchanging. It's a metaphor that doesn't allow for the fact that, for example, there is migration. It doesn't allow for the fact that in reality, states don't work with single fixed borders, but in fact change dramatically. We can't imagine a human body being split in two, like, say, Czechoslovakia was split into two independent states. But this happens throughout human history. If we imagine, say, Europe in Hobbes's time, there were hundreds of states in operation, as well as the Holy Roman Empire. If we look at Europe in 1900, we have only 20 states. If we look at Europe now, we have closer to 50 states. So the body is not fixed. So this metaphor again struck me as something that was inadequate. So in its place, I put up a very different metaphor, the idea of political society as something we should understand as a kind of collection of different communities of persons. If you like, an archipelago of different associations, both political and non-political, in which people are members. And what we should understand about this association of associations is that it's not something fixed. It's something that's constantly changeable. It's a realm in which people move from region to region, and it's a realm in which the boundaries of human association that sometimes confine them are themselves entirely changeable and variable. So we live now in a world which has a little over 200 states. Who knows what the world will be like in 100 years' time? It was certainly very different 100 years ago. So in trying to imagine a good society, I wanted to suggest we shouldn't try to think of it as modeled after a single, fixed, closed society in the way that, for example, the philosopher John Rawls imagines it quite explicitly, because he says, you know, a good society should be understood as something that's closed. In fact, it should be one in which there isn't even any immigration, because if a society was a good society, why would people want to leave it? Why would they move? So I want to imagine an understanding of the good society that says a good society is actually, firstly, one that could take many different forms, but overall, to the extent that our theorizing recognizes this, it should at least use a metaphor that recognizes the movement of people from one place to another. The other thing, though, it should recognize is that in a good society, what we have is not only a variety of associations, but we also have a variety of values. And this then brings me to, in a sense, the philosophical core of the understanding that I want to defend. Liberal political theorists, people like John Rawls and F.A. Hayek and Will Kinmaker included, all in a sense begin with the thought that what we have to recognize is the diversity not only of human experience, but also of human values and human ethical commitments. We live in a world in which people worship different gods, they have different ends and aspirations, and they have different understandings of what is right and wrong. Now, if this is the case, the question is, how do we manage to live together given this diversity or variety of ends? Some philosophers, going back most strikingly to Plato, have thought that what we need is guidance by those who rule, but those who rule when in possession of genuine knowledge about what is the best form of life. Liberalism is the philosophy that most strikingly and clearly says forms of life are varied. What we need are institutions that recognize this, that don't aspire to bring us all to live under the rule of a single ideal or under the rule of a single God. What we need is a kind of political order that recognizes the diversity of human values. But this immediately brought us to a particular problem. Doesn't even this aspiration require the guidance of some particular value, that is the value of recognizing the diversity of value? Philosophers like John Rawls have recognized this and said, what we need, therefore, is a unifying theory which accommodates this diversity of values. And that theory, he has suggested, is a theory of justice. We must all live according to rules of justice. So the role of the philosopher then is to help guide us to thinking about what are the rules of a just order, recognizing that a just order that will require and in fact make possible a diversity of people to live according to a diversity of values, pursuing a diversity of ends. The conception, though, on this view is still the ideal of a single society unified by this conception, a shared understanding of what is justice. What I've tried to argue in opposition to this is to suggest that actually this is not the way to think about the diversity that we find in the world, the diversity of ends that people have, and the diversity of values and ethical beliefs that people have. Because to think of this under the aspect of justice is to take too narrow and fixed a conception of what the rules or the norms of order should be. What it assumes is that there is a much greater capacity for people to come to a shared understanding of values than is in fact the case. Moreover, I've tried to argue that trying to appeal to an ideal of justice in a world in which people, in fact, we know, hold to different ideals of what a just society is like, can only lead us to endless, at best, debate, if not conflict, about what should be the rules or norms that satisfy the requirements of justice. So what I've suggested is a better way of thinking about the norms that should govern us is to say that what we need is a norm of toleration, one that recognizes the diversity of ethical views, the diversity of ends, and indeed the diversity of understandings of justice, so that what we establish or build upon or accept is a world in which different ethical norms can coexist. And what this means is recognizing overall, as a most fundamental principle, the freedom of people to not so much associate and form a unity with one another, but their freedom to dissociate, to dissent from one another, to move off in separate realms, to live separately according to their own lights. So that the kinds of associations we find in the human world will be constantly changing as people readapt and readjust, change their thinking, and so form different kinds of political associations, different kinds of moral communities in a world that's going to be always in flux. This, I think, is both better descriptively of the way the world is, but also better as an ideal about how the world should live. Now, if this is the case, what this means in terms of liberal political theory is to adopt an attitude that says a liberal society is one that will tolerate a great range of diverse and contradictory ways of living. In fact, it will go so far as to say that a liberal society is one that accepts the possibility that people living within that society will not themselves hold to liberal values or live in liberal ways. A liberal society will be genuinely diverse because it will contain all kinds of ethical traditions. What makes this realm a liberal realm is that what it encompasses is such a range and diversity of ways of life that it will even tolerate those who don't abide by these values. Now, of course, there are all kinds of complications that then arise, because it immediately raises, among other things, the question of whether this is simply, a realm of anarchy, whether it's possible for there to be political authority at all. And these are all questions that I try to address in the book. And I won't try to recite the detail of the argument in these few brief opening remarks. But I hope I've given you enough to get a sense of the overall picture I'm trying to defend. Let me conclude then by saying a little bit about where this has led me in some of my subsequent work. I have a book that's coming out within the next year called Immigration and Freedom. And in this, what I try to explore is the question of the claims of people to move freely in the world across different societies and between states. And what I've defended is a view that suggests that the most important reason for defending the idea of immigration is not because it's economically beneficial, it's not because it brings about changes that are politically advantageous. It's simply because ultimately a world in which people can move is a world in which freedom is somehow something that's very, very important and something that's protected. Now, in this, what I do is, in a sense, look a bit more closely at one aspect of the argument that I defend in the Liberal Archipelago. The other thing I do is suggest that this is important not only because in a liberal society, one values the freedom of people to move from one country to another or one realm to another, but we also recognize that the existence of that freedom means that not only are outsiders subject to less control should they wish to move, but it also means that we live in a society in which internal restrictions and controls on people are much less prevalent, because a society which controls the movement of outsiders can only work if it ends up controlling the people within it, people who will invariably associate with those who come from abroad, who associate with the people who are within a society. So in the end, what I try to do is look a bit more closely at the ideal of freedom from the larger perspective that I've developed in this earlier work, The Liberal Archipelago. So I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of what my thinking is, where this work tries to develop these ideas, and then perhaps where this has led me. This last part is really simply an advertisement to get you to buy my next book. And perhaps with that, I'll leave it and open things up to questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Kukathas. Now is the turn for the people that is here with us in Zoom. So if any of you have questions, please let me know, and well, you can unmute yourselves and make the questions you want, or comments you want to make to the professor. If not, I will start myself, if it's possible. Well, giving the rest of the people a chance to think about comments or questions, I have one. This is like a normal discussion that we have in our institute, and not only about your book, but also when we discuss, for example, a strong and indigenous communities in Latin America. Something that you have mentioned and that you mentioned in your book is that we should have this right to get out of the community or the state or whatever group we live in. But what happens with, for example, these vulnerable people, let's say elderly or people that have mental issues, or even minors, children that cannot actually have this right of getting outside the community, and that they are living in a restrictive community that let's say, beginning with female genital mutilation, but also with marriage, child marriage, and in these kind of things. So here is when I think that I don't know if we have the enough tools to face these kind of situations, or if we have to find an outside solution. I don't know. What do you think about these issues?
Mm-hmm. Mm. Yes. So these are very different examples, but they share something in common, and that is that when we look at the way that other societies live, we often find that we don't like the way they live. Okay, we find this ethically troubling. So let me give you a different example before I try to address the case that you mentioned. Okay, in some societies, for example, abortion is readily available, and for some people, this is something that is intolerable because the aborting of a human fetus is the taking of an innocent life. Okay? Now, there are some countries in the world which have very, very harsh laws punishing those who commit abortions, just as there are countries in the world which have very tolerant attitudes towards abortion, maybe even going so far as acknowledging the rights of women to abort an unwanted fetus. In some cases, of course, these laws are qualified. There are restrictions on the degree to which you can get an abortion. Maybe a time set, or there may be conditions such as the health of the woman. But there's a great range of laws about this. Okay? Now, one of the things I'm arguing is that this is something that we should not be trying to do. That is to say, we should not be trying to get a uniformity of laws. Okay? Because we do differ about these things on fundamental levels. There are some people for whom committing an abortion is a horrific crime, and then there are others for whom not having the right to get an abortion is a horrific invasion. Okay? The philosopher Ronald Dworkin argued in his book Law's Empire that what we must avoid is a world in which there are checkerboard principles, where there are some principles in some parts of the United States and other principles in another part of the United States. He was imagining, the United States as 50 states. And he went so far as to argue that it would be better if all the states had the wrong laws than to have a world in which different states had different laws, some of which were right and some of which were wrong. Okay. So the view I want to put is the case for checkerboard principles. It would be great if we all somehow naturally converged upon the correct view. What I would hope, but this may be a somewhat pious hope, is that through argument and persuasion, through rational dialogue, we will be able to persuade one another to move in the right direction to an ethically more defensible point of view. But I also suspect that on some issues, we will never be able to do this. I suspect we will always be divided on the question of abortion, for example, and for very easily understandable reasons. So whenever I'm confronted with an extreme example, such as, for example, the case of female genital mutilation, my own view is that this is a horrific practice. Okay? From everything that I've read and studied about it, it's a bad practice. At the same time, I'm hesitant to say, so therefore, once we see something, and there is a big question, who is the relevant we? We should step in to try to simply correct it, because we should take the attitude that we have the correct ethical standpoint and we should impose it. This is a very, very demanding standard to take, to say that, no, we should forbear from exercising our power. So in the end, what the stance I'm taking is saying is that what we have to do is find ways of forbearing from exercising power to correct what we see as wrongs committed by others who have that power. But it's a very, very difficult thing not to be tempted to do. Let me say one other thing specifically about your example, which is the hard case of female genital mutilation. There is an interesting parallel in history here, which is the case of foot binding in China, which was, again, a similarly horrific practice, which was very damaging to women, ended up making many of them not just physically ill, but stunted and living lives of extreme pain. Despite numerous attempts to ban the practice just could not be eliminated by force, because those who were committed to the practice had their own ethical convictions and rational strategies for maintaining this. What ultimately eliminated the practice was bringing a small percentage of people within the communities that practice this to understand why it was harmful and get them in small collectives to change their practices. And eventually this practice died out as more and more groups adopted the changed understanding. In sub-Saharan Africa, where FGM is most prevalently to be found, the strategies for trying to eliminate it have similarly changed because they've drawn on the example of foot binding in China. This is what I would like to argue for, not simply say, well, look, anything goes, that just because someone practices it, that means it must be okay. I think we should engage in criticism of other ways and practices, but what we should resist is the temptation simply to use force to try to correct it.
Thank you so much. I think Paco wanted to say something.
Hello, Professor Kukathas. It's been a pleasure. I loved your book. I participated in the seminar and I was also at your talk about immigration in Madrid.
Yes, thank you. Nice to see you.
I have several comments. I loved your criticism of the sheep metaphor and the body metaphor. Obviously, they are too simplistic and they break down when you push them a little. And I think it's important to understand why. But then I also must criticize your metaphor. An archipelago is something where islands are separated. They are physical bodies of land separated by water, and they have clear boundaries. So in an archipelago, there would be no problems. The problem is that true societies are not archipelagos. They are not as finely separated, clearly divided, and with a physical space of water. So what do you think about that? I have other questions or comments, but this is this one.
Yes, yes. Well, I talk a little bit in a little bit more detail in the book about the conception of the archipelago. So one of the things I recognize is that actually islands themselves aren't fixed, because in the nature of islands, they themselves are masses of land that change and transform. There are things called archipelagic aprons, which is the seabed around them, and with changes in climate and the formation and movement of tectonic plates, islands themselves come together and separate. So they themselves don't have these fixed boundaries. So that's one of the things I wanted to mention in the book. The other thing I say in the book is that what's characteristic of the seas between these islands is that they're full of people themselves, because people are always moving across and between these different islands. So the point of the metaphor, in a way, was to firstly give you a different image than that of a body. Secondly, I wanted to draw the contrast with the archipelago in Solzhenitsyn's metaphor, the Gulag archipelago. And what was characteristic of the archipelago there is that every island, every Gulag, was a place where no one could leave, at least not voluntarily, or or not in a casket. The key principle in the Liberal Archipelago I've suggested is the freedom to leave. Whatever else you might have, whatever else others may claim on you, no one can claim upon you the duty to remain where you are. Now, this does not give you any guarantees anywhere, because others may not be willing to take you or not willing to take you on your terms. Okay? But what it wants to emphasize is that in the understanding that I'm imagining, no one has that deep authority over you. Ultimately, the authority that anyone has over you only exists to the extent that you are willing to acquiesce in it. And that's not unconditional, because none of us lives in a world in which we can demand anything of anybody else unconditionally. Everything we do is conditioned by something about the fact that we have to cooperate and live together. So that's really the thing that I was trying to get at with the metaphor. Of course, like every metaphor, it has its limitations, because if it was a perfect metaphor, it would cease to be a metaphor.
Great. My second point is regarding the notion of illiberal groups inside the archipelago. In what sense could we call them illiberal if the members in those groups really voluntarily and freely accepted the restrictions that other people might consider, oh, well, but these are limitations on freedom? Yes, but they are voluntarily accepted limitations on freedom. I understand if we define freedom very abstractly as property and non-aggression, that's okay, but that's not enough to live in society. In society, we make many contracts with other people, and all those contracts are rules, and rules are restrictions that go beyond mere property and not non-aggression. So that's a very, very hard discussion. Why do we call them illiberal and not ourselves or not others? Because their rules are very harsh. Well, they may be very harsh, very restrictive, but if they have accepted, maybe they have a reason for doing so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to the extent that they, accept that the norms that ultimately govern them grant people, the freedom to leave. You might say that they're liberal in that sense, but you might also recognize that within a particular community, the norms that govern those who, even if voluntarily so, remain, restrict their freedom. You might still say that they are, in a sense, illiberal norms, even if they're ones that that everyone willingly accepts. Let me, draw your attention to the way I tried to make this contrast in the book. I suggest that we, imagine a society in which what we have is essentially something like a society of monks. They live in a monastery. Within this monastery, people's freedom is severely constrained because there are very, very few things that they are really permitted to do. They're permitted to worship. They have very little choice in terms of their clothing, in terms of their sexual orientation, in terms of their consumption in all kinds of other ways. The only thing they've got is the freedom to leave this community. Now, imagine a different society in which the people can do almost anything they want. Let's say it's it has all the freedoms that you might expect of the most free state in the United States, and there's a great deal of freedom with respect to your worship, your sexuality, your dress, your consumption. Now, then imagine that the people in this society are made up of people who've been captured from the monastery and forced to live in this second society. Now, in this society, they're forced to live in a way that leaves them free to do anything they want. Okay, there are no restrictions on them, but they can't leave it. Now, in one sense, the second society is the one in which people can live, completely freely, but they can't get out of this. They can't go somewhere and, cleave to the things that they really are committed to. Whereas in the former society, they're living like monks, but voluntarily so. So for the sake of argument, what I'm saying is that, the monastery is, in a sense, illiberal because all the norms internally are liberal, but it has something that's more important. People can disavow this and go somewhere else. In the second society, people are much freer in a way, but this freedom is not what's important to them. Okay? So even if that freedom makes it a more liberal society, that's not what's the important thing. So we can debate the semantics of the term liberal, but I don't think that's the crucial thing, really. For me, the crucial thing is the contrast. We could use different words to make sure we don't just get tangled up in terminology. But the terminology is not the crucial thing. It's the contrast that I want to make.
Sure. I don't care about the use of words if we understand what they mean. The problem is that if we say we are pro-freedom, we are obviously anti-freedom, so anti-illiberalism, so we might feel tempted to attack that monastery or to rescue the monks because they do not live in freedom. And I think we would be wrong by doing that, because those restrictions have been accepted by themselves. They have imposed them on themselves freely. It's like this self-referential freedom acting kind of against itself, but in a perfectly legitimate way. The last thing had to do with freedom of disassociation, and now I kind of like this again. I often challenge my colleagues, telling them the problem is not freedom of disassociation per se. The problem is clarifying the terms of association before entering an association. And there might be associations that do not accept you leaving it. Once you get in, I'm sorry that you cannot get out. Or you can only get out after certain time or fulfilling certain conditions. You cannot just say, I want to become a soldier, I'm going to enter the army, and then when I don't feel satisfied on where I am afraid, I leave. Oh no, sorry, you cannot leave. Or there may be secret societies where if you enter, you find out about some secret, and the society, the safety of the society, they may not leave you. I don't know how important this impossibility or limits to this association is, but I would even say that it would be compatible with freedom, again, because you accepted it knowingly before. The problem is that usually this is not the case. Many people have never explicitly stated, okay, I accept to belong to this group, and I accept that I will never be able to leave. And also changing this of course, you deal with this in the book, and we discuss it a lot. From the point of view of individual, leaving an association has huge costs. Personal costs, relatives, friends, loss of capital, problem with traditions, with culture, with language. So usually if people do it, it's because they are in very hard situations. But then also from the point of view of the group, it is interesting that some groups do not want to lose members. So again, they will apply barriers to exit. You can see this, for instance, in the Islamic religion, with if you become an apostate, you may be killed. So that the limits to this association are strong.
Yes, I mean, I think you've raised a question with really a lot of complications. I mean, even if one thinks about, for example, the obligations that one might incur on entering an association, so much depends upon the association in question. For example, in many cases, it's quite clear that you might enter, for example, into a contract to, let's say, to work, and you're bound now by the terms of the contract. But should you decide to break the contract, this does not mean that the person with whom you've contracted, or the corporation or the company, can force you to remain within that association. But what they may be able to do, and in most cases will be able to do, is to demand compensation. If it's a legal contract, you can break it, but not without compensation. But now, in some cases, leaving even with compensation is not possible. For example, I think you mentioned the case of joining the army. Well, you can't suddenly, in the middle of a battle say, look, I've changed my mind. I'm just going to leave now because, I don't care whether this endangers everybody else. It's my right to dissociate. In my view, you do have that right, but when one looks at specific cases, one always has to understand it in the context in which the case has to be examined. The other complication when we're not looking at contractual arrangements is when we're thinking about people who've just found themselves in associations rather than joined them. Children, for example, are the most obvious case. So one of the things you have is the question of what claims do children have to leave these associations? At what point do they acquire that particular right to make a determination? And again, in the history of human thinking about this, the age of consent, or the age of culpability, or the age at which you can simply enter into a contractual arrangement is something that differs, enormously. It's not as if there is a naturally correct age. So if this is the case, what does one say about communities that recognize, say, your culpability at the age of 10, or the age of consent at the age of 12? I mean, I think these things can't be settled philosophically. These things are, in the end, things that different societies will have to, engage with each other about and, argue about. What I would simply reject is the idea that there is some authority who can be given the power to determine the correct answer to these things, on the assumption that somehow it will find the people who know the correct answer. There isn't such a thing.
I don't know if Paco wanted to say something else. Related to what you were discussing, and also getting back to my previous question, I kind of perfectly understand what you're saying. For me, the main problem is when you are not allowed to leave, because you are, for example, under the age that we have decided that you are capable of living. And sometimes, for example, I put the example of FGM because that's the example that I have studied the most. So if you are over the age that we have decided that gives you capability to make the decision, even though I don't like the practice, I am perfectly okay with it. My main problem is that normally these kind of practices happen to girls from 1 year old to 3-4 years old. And sometimes these girls want to live at that moment because they don't want to be hurt. And of course, I don't neither see that we as a society or the state has a right to go there and take your kids. But at the same time, if you don't want to undergo FGM and no one is protecting your right to say no to sometimes a deadly harm, because some childs die because of FGM. How can we? I mean, I understand this extremely difficult to, and I don't expect like a strong answer from your side. But for me, the problem is that how we can manage this situation, how we can help those childs that are trapped in a community that they don't want to be part of, and that they are also harmful for them, not just because we don't share the same values or we don't like the practice, but because these practices are harmful for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree with you that there are these particular harmful practices. I think sadly, the ones that you've mentioned are not the only examples of harmful practices. We find these in all kinds of communities, and including communities that we find that are not so obscure or unusual. You'll find examples of, sadly, child abuse in all kinds of places. And the problem, in a way, is very similar. How do you address this? Because you're trying to find a balance between, on the one hand, respecting the integrity of particular communities, respecting the relationships that people have built within families, respecting the authority that parents have over children, because this is the way that our society is organized, and yet at the same time figuring out how to protect those who are vulnerable within this. And we've tried and developed many different sorts of institutions to address this to varying degrees of success. Some of these institutions are more coercive than others, but many of those are not coercive, but involve trying to get people to communicate with both with one another and with people in the outside world, because these problems are in fact so difficult. It's not as if you say you find a family in which there is domestic abuse, that simply going in and charging the husband is going to resolve the problem. If it were, then life would be a lot less complicated. So what this suggests to me is that the tools we've got to think about for addressing these questions are in fact much subtler tools, which will only develop if what we have are communities of people who relate to one another in a particular way. If they relate to one another primarily through the resources of a powerful political authority, which can charge them with one thing or another and use force to try to mend things, then we're going to do a lot worse. But at the same time, I understand that so often the temptation is simply to go in and use force and use sanctions in order to fix things, because the danger to some vulnerable is so great. I think we're always searching for that balance, and I don't think we can describe an institutional answer to this that's going to be satisfying.
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. I have a final question. We'll have some questions from YouTube too, but my question is not specifically related to your book, but to your concept of liberty. We are about to discuss in a couple of weeks one of the books of Philip Pettit, the New Republican author, and I wanted to ask you your opinion about this Republican sense of freedom that needs from you to be free, that you have the resources, and that basically sees freedom as non-domination and non-interference. And I wanted to ask you your opinion about these concepts of liberty.
Okay, well, I think Philip Pettit has been one of the leading figures in trying to develop and clarify an understanding of freedom. And I think, for me at least, the most important insight that's to be found in his understanding of freedom as non-domination is that he wants to emphasize that freedom is not something that simply exists if the scope of your activities is not limited, because a great deal of what's important about the kind of freedom you enjoy is to be found in the fact that you can enjoy it as a certain kind of person. You can enjoy that freedom because not only can you do what you wish, but you can also do it without living in fear, or without simply getting that freedom because you're able to either pretend to be something you're not, or you can get it only by, say, for example, being obsequious towards those who are more powerful. I think this is an extremely important thing. And Pettit doesn't claim great originality for this, but what he's trying to do is recover something he sees in earlier thinkers who wanted to emphasize this. And I'm completely on board with him on this one. I think where he and I would differ is probably firstly in his wish to try to establish the principle of non-domination. as a kind of touchstone or standard by which we can comprehensively assess the freedom of one kind of person, or one kind of association or another, by looking at the extent of non-domination. And with that, he also wants to emphasize the importance of recognizing the resilience of someone's possession of that freedom. I think where I disagree with him there is, firstly, is that I don't think we can get a clear standard, because all too often we find ourselves in a situation where we gain more freedom in one respect, but at the price of losing some freedom in another respect. And I don't think we can come up with a theory or a conception of freedom that allows us to measure it. Whereas I think implicit in his view is the idea that we can measure the amount of freedom. I think we can make some comparative judgments, but on the whole, I think that they're going to be much more rough. And sometimes we're going to say about some people or communities, look, yes, they are more dominated, but they're actually more free than people who are in different circumstances. One of the reasons might be simply that even though they're dominated, they prefer the condition of being dominated to one in which they're less dominated but less able to practice what they want. Take, for example, the case of the monasteries that I mentioned. All of those people in the monastery are, in a sense, dominated completely by the regulations of the monastery, maybe to a very, very high degree. But this is what's important to them. They don't want to be in the other society where they have all these other freedoms, because this is where they would rather be. It may even be that sometimes they would rather be here because the alternative that's available to them is one that gives them many other freedoms that they would like, but at the cost of the one they most value. So what's, I think, crucial in the end is that our judgments about freedom depend a lot on what we think is valuable. And from my view, the crucial thing is, what does the person whose freedom is at stake value most? Okay? But this gives us what's sometimes described in the literature as a moralized conception of freedom. I think that's inescapable. I think people like Philip Pettit want to have a non-moralized theory, and for good reason. But I think this is unattainable. The other thing that I would disagree with him about is, I think, at the more practical level. I think his very strong views about the importance of non-domination suggests a theory of institutions that are designed to diminish non-domination. But the way to do this is to have authorities or powers that have the capacity to eliminate this. But this means creating a more powerful authority still. Now, there are all kinds of ways you might check this, and Philip Pettit has an elaborate theory about how one might do this, but I'm more skeptical about this. I think in the end, the best we can do is to disperse power, to have as few very, very powerful authorities or forces in the world. But the price you pay for that is that many injustices may go unaddressed because no one has got the capacity to address them. That's, I think, how I would compare our two views.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's move to YouTube. We have a couple of questions from the audience. The first one is your opinion about Nozick's society model, the utopia of utopias. He said he was against Rawls' ideas. How does it merge with your own ideas? I guess Nozick's ideas.
Yeah. Well, I'm very sympathetic to Nozick's ideas, especially his ideas in the third part of Anarchy, State, and Utopia. This is the part that's essentially about utopia. And Nozick has a very interesting conception of utopia. What he says is, given that people have different ideas about what is the best kind of society in which to live, it would be very unattractive to describe as utopia a society that only you think is ideal, because why would anybody else want to live there? So utopia would be a place in which there are, many different ideas about how one should live. Now, he's also, I think, astute enough to recognize that it's necessary, therefore, in this utopia of utopias, that each individual utopia is also, to some extent, a place of compromise. Because once again, if people are free to associate in societies that they find ideal, why would anybody else want to join your utopia if it was so narrowly focused on your preferences? Every utopia will be, to some extent, a kind of compromise among different kinds of views, but people would cluster. Okay? So this is a view that's that I find extremely congenial. And so I generally like Nozick's conception of utopia. It matches my view of liberalism. Where we differ is that what Nozick argues in Anarchy, State, and Utopia is that the utopia is a framework that's understood or given by the state. What the state does, he says, is provide the framework for utopia. Within the state, you can have lots of different kinds of communities, but the state provides the basic structure. And what I ask is, why it is that you need this basic structure? Okay? What is it that this thing is contributing? Because within the terms of his own theory, it doesn't really contribute anything. If it provides a framework that allows different utopias to be discovered, it's not clear why you need this for it to be discovered. If it presents a framework that stops certain sorts of utopias from forming, then why is this a good thing, given that it might prevent all kinds of things that are valuable from emerging? So in Nozick's book, what he starts off by doing is trying to reject anarchism. He shows why anarchism is undesirable. Then he defends the minimal state. And then he defends the idea that the minimal state can be utopian. But what doesn't really work, I think, is his explanation for why it is that you wouldn't get a more utopian world by his own theory with the state. Why is this better than anarchy? So that's my own assessment of Nozick's view.
Thank you so much. I will have one more question from you. This question said, I believe what you are proposing is a model similar to the Liechtenstein. As Latin American thinkers, how we can proceed to pursue the Liberal Archipelago against the fat nationalism?
So there's an old joke that about someone asking for directions, and the person who's offering the directions says, well, the first thing I have to tell you is that you can't get there from here. It's very, very difficult to suggest a blueprint or a clear pathway to an ideal society. It simply doesn't exist. There are too many variables. There are too many political realities to move up against. I don't think any political philosopher, with the possible exception of Marx, has really offered a kind of theory that others have taken on board as a guide, although even in Marx's case, it's very, very dubious that any application of that guide has led people to where they thought they were going to go. So I don't think that there is a solution that I can offer. In more general terms, though, all that I've tried to do in my own writings and speaking about these issues has been to say that the most important value that I want to push forward, that I want to advance, that I want to encourage, is a value of freedom, understood, if you like, as something that implies an attitude of toleration to other views. Now, this is in itself not going to get you a solution to practical problems. It's not going to supply an antidote to nationalism, because in the end, all you're saying is that the best we can do is be tolerant of others and then argue a case for their being tolerant and respecting the freedom of others. Now, why should one expect that this will in fact lead to any particular determinate outcome? The short answer is that it won't. That's not going to happen in itself. What you'll also need then within particular contexts, political societies, is different forms of political agitation, different ways of building coalitions of people to advance particular sorts of policies, to try to remove particular restrictions on individual freedom, to build a more tolerant society, and to argue against nationalist sentiment, which is primarily what I do in the next book that I've got coming out on immigration and freedom. It's essentially a critique of nationalism. But the critique itself is not going to achieve their political goal. That's something for people who are more actively engaged in politics to pursue in different ways.
Thank you so much. Here we have Christine Henderson, because she has a problem to unmute herself. So she wrote me here the question. She's asking if you can say a little bit more about the centrality of conscience and toleration in your thought.
Okay. So when I started trying to develop the basic ideas that underpin this work, one thought was simply to say that what liberalism, just the view that I'm defending essentially, requires is a certain kind of neutrality. It's a view that tries to, because it wants to recognize the diversity of values, it tries to abstract away from any kind of commitment to any particular value. Now, the problem with this philosophically has always been that that neutrality will either turn out to be untrue, because any kind of set of political principles or norms will favor one kind of set of values or another, or will simply turn out to be incoherent because it doesn't give you any motivation for any kind of moral action. In other words, it has an inadequate moral psychology. So what I try to acknowledge is that, yes, in the end, we must recognize some moral commitment to something. Okay? So what I was searching for was some very, very minimal commitment that I thought would be very, very widely accessible to people. So what I wanted to start with is the idea that all human beings in principle can acknowledge or recognize that they have a sense of what's right and wrong, which is not to say that this is innate. It may have been inculcated, but in all human societies, human beings grow up ultimately with some understanding, some view that there's a difference between what's right and wrong. Okay? They all think that they have an understanding, and they think that you should act on what's right. Okay? We can leave aside maybe those who are sociopaths, but for the most part, this is the way that people think, even though they differ about this. So what I tried to do, therefore, is to say, look, let's recognize this as something that's important about human beings, perhaps even what's most important about human beings in terms of what they value. Because the reason we're having this argument or this debate or this discussion is because we're all committed in some way to an understanding of what's right and wrong. We want to figure out what it is. And for the most part, we want to see that view instantiated. Okay? So I want to say, okay, let's start with this. Let's start by recognizing that everybody has a conscience and that we should recognize and respect that conscience. This is the first step towards trying to resolve our ethical differences without the use of violence or without the use of force. Okay? So it is, in a sense, I want to argue, the basis for our taking the stance of toleration. The idea is what we do is we forswear the use of force or of violence to try to bring our own preferred moral conception, to the front. So this is simply a starting point. Now, it's not one I understand that everyone's going to accept, because some people are simply going to say, no, we must start with a more substantive understanding of what's right. I can't offer a derivation or a deduction of this starting point. I can only appeal to its attraction as an idea, and it's ultimately the idea that underpins the thinking behind my views. If you want another way of expressing it, it's in Christ's injunction, resist not evil. But this is a very, very difficult standard to adopt, because it's, in a sense, asking you to forbear from violence or from the exercise of force, even when you think it is warranted, even when you think it's necessary to combat evil or wrong. So I can only give you this sensibility. I can't give you this conclusion as a deduction from something you would otherwise accept.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was such an interesting discussion. We don't have more questions, so if you agree, we can finish here. And again, thank you so much for accepting our. Well,
thank you very much for going to the trouble of organizing this. It's been a pleasure. It's nice to see you all again.
Thank you so much, Professor. Bye bye.
Hope to see you again soon.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.